We're going to talk about those principles of investigation, evidential principles of investigation that we're then going to apply to the resurrection. Now look, there is a similarity between working cold cases and investigating the resurrection, believe it or not. And I've illustrated it for you here on the chalkboard. Cold cases are really assembled. They're old. That's why I put a calendar here. They are really old in the distant past. I mean, my cases are sometimes 35 years old. Not only that, they are, for the most part, there are no living eyewitnesses, and I don't have any DNA. If there was a living eyewitness who was still around who could tell me who did it, it wouldn't be a cold case, okay? If I had good forensic evidence, I could have solved this years ago. The reason why it's still open in an unsolved murder is because it happened in the distant past and there are no living eyewitnesses and there is no way to solve this or make a case forensically with DNA or fingerprints. Well, that's very similar, if you think about it, to the case for Christianity. We have an event in the distant past for which we have no living eyewitnesses we can still interview, and we can't make the case with DNA and fingerprints. We're going to have to make it a different way. That's what we're trying to convince people in the culture, that you actually could make this case the same way you would examine any claim about the past, whether it's 30 years ago, 70 years ago, or 2,000 years ago. So let's just jump into some basic principles that I use when I ask the question, how are we going to evaluate evidence? How are we going to evaluate evidence? So let's just jump right into it. First of all, I want you to see that you have to take certain principles into account. The first is, and again, some of these, I'll just confess to you, unlike the last session where some of the rules of evidence are like, oh, okay, that makes sense, but I never thought of it that way. What I'm about to go through with you now are some simple principles that are like duh principles. Really? Like duh. That just seems like so obvious. But, to be honest, we don't often do these things, and we don't often communicate these things to the skeptics we're trying to convince. Simple principles. And sometimes the simplest principles are the ones that make the most progress in cases. I think sometimes people think that we go to a crime scene and we pull out all this wazoo kind of high-tech CSI TV stuff, which doesn't exist, and we are swabbing the air and vacuuming in DNA particles. Please. No, we're doing the simple duh stuff that if you just do this simple stuff, we're going to end up solving the case. It's much simpler than you might think. So let's just go through some simple principles. Here's the first investigative principle that's pretty simple, and that is this. I know this is going to sound really basic. You got to read the case book completely. You got to read it thoroughly. Here's what I mean by that. We have a vault in our department. It looks kind of like this shelf I'm showing you. We have on that vault, we have cases that are open and cases that are closed. The cases that we have solved, the murders that we have solved, as you see here, are in black notebooks. Okay? Black notebooks. The red notebooks you see here are the cases that are unsolved. So when I started, I actually was one of the first founding members of our cold case unit. When I walked in our homicide vault, I simply looked at that shelf and I said, okay, let's pull every red notebook off the shelf and let's start reading through the notebooks because these are the unsolved cases. These are the red notebooks. Now, I'll show you, here's our notebook a little bit closer, okay? I want to give you some basic principles. When I say read the case book thoroughly or completely, here's what I mean by that. What I mean is, before I can begin to jump off and make conclusions about the status of the case, make conclusions about whether or not the case is even worth reopening, whether or not the case is even still workable, I have to read this silly thing from cover to cover. And sometimes it's a 5-inch notebook, and it's in pretty bad shape because no one's looked at it in 30 years. And over the years, every time someone found some piece of paper that was related to that DR number, that case number, they just jam it in the notebook. And so I got this notebook that's a mess. But I got to read that thing cover to cover. Now you'll see here that I got to read it even though a lot of these reports are difficult to read. I don't mean just difficult because they're not copied well. I mean that they are sometimes highly scientific reports. Some of them are coroner's reports with language and terminology that I have to kind of learn in order to read the report. So some are difficult. Also, they're hard to understand sometimes because of the nature of the specialized sciences that sometimes are used in criminal investigations. And if you're not somebody who understands all the anatomical language that is described in a coroner's report at an autopsy, you're going to have to start learning that stuff in order to actually understand what's being said in that report from the autopsy. And I'll tell you another thing. A lot of these are sadly kind of boring. They are. So you have a bunch of reports in my red notebook that are either difficult, hard to understand, or boring. Not only that, sometimes because these reports have been jammed together over time, they are not in the right order. So I got to try to understand the correct order of events. Or what happens is people will organize the reports based on the nature of the report. So maybe instead of having it from what happened from day 1 to day 400, they just taken all the proper reports and put them under one tab. All the autopsy and coroner's reports, put them under one tab. All the CSI reports, put them under one tab. All the supplemental reports, put them under one tab. So now it's not really in the right order, but they have been organized by type. That's one way to organize a casebook. I can understand why you might do that, but typically the first thing I do is reorder it. I reorder it into the chronological order. In other words, I got to move some of these reports around. And the reason why that's helpful for me is because then it helps me to see what was discovered first, what happened, and then, so for example, if I think, oh, this suspect looks good, I can read a little further to see, oh, this is when they disqualified. This is when they eliminated him from the case. And if I put it in the right chronological order, I'm not going to be as easily confused by that. So this is important to put the reports in the right order. Also, I've got to resist the temptation to just pull some report out, because it's like the last one that was put in, and go, oh, look at this conclusion. I can't read any report in isolation from the other reports, because if I do, I'm likely to come to a bad conclusion. I've got to read the report in the chronology of the case to see how it relates to what happened before and what happened after. Then I've got a better sense of what is happening. Now, why do I say that? Well, you can see where I'm headed with this. Let's just analogize this to reading our scripture. This is why I think a lot of skeptics go wrong too, but also why a lot of Christians aren't able to make a case for what they believe, because they really have never read the case from cover to cover. That's the first thing we're going to have to do. The same way you would read the red notebook from cover to cover, here we want to read the red Bible from cover to cover. Even though, yeah, I get it, some of these books, just like in my red books, are difficult. Some of these reports are difficult. Some of these are hard to understand, and some of these are even boring. I get all that. That's true for my casebooks too. Doesn't matter. If you want to understand what's in this book, you're going to have to read it cover to cover and push through, or do what you can to learn the language that makes these reports accessible to you. We have to do that in criminal trials, right? We have to do that in casebooks. We have to learn the language. And I would say to somebody who's skeptical or has some objection to Christianity, it's often because they haven't taken the time to learn the language of that particular report and to see how it fits because of language issues. They've never read the entire book cover to cover. Also, just like we have in casebooks, it's important for us to try to understand the correct order of things. And as you know right now, your Bible is ordered based on types, right? Major prophets, minor prophets. You see, it's not necessarily in the actual chronological order, although you can go online and you can purchase hardcover Bibles in which they will try to order the books chronologically, or order the passages. Have you ever done that? It's really a fascinating read, right? Because typically we don't do that. We're typically reading the books either, if we were going to read cover to cover even, you would not necessarily be reading them in the exact order in which the events occurred. But if you buy one of those special Bibles or go online, it's in Bible software also, you can actually read them in the correct order. That's very helpful to reorder the books. It's worth doing at least once. But here's another thing. We have to resist the temptation to read any report in isolation. A friend of mine, Greg Kokel, has become like a brother, like a true brother to me. This is a guy who wrote up, he always says, never read a Bible verse. And he says this in a way that's kind of provocative, because what he really means is don't read a verse in isolation. You got to read everything in the context of where it's written. Same thing is true with our case books. You can't read one report in isolation. You come to false conclusions. So I always offer this kind of an illustration. This is an illustration from Forensic Faith on the chalkboard here. Here's a verse taken out of context from Psalm 56. And you can see this young lady who says, "Be merciful to me, O God, for men hotly pursue me." Well, this is clearly a verse taken out of context, because the context of the verse tells us that it's really David talking, saying, "Be merciful to me, O God, for men hotly pursue me all day long. They press their attack. My slanderers pursue me all day long. Many are attacking me in their pride. When I'm afraid, I will trust in you." So now we have two verses. This is not really a verse that was intended by God to be read by attractive women who are concerned that men are hotly pursuing them. Although if you take it out of context, you might think that was the case. Clearly it isn't. So I just want you to apply the same simple. Now I say this also because those people who are skeptical of our beliefs often haven't applied this simple investigative principle. Read the casebook thoroughly.